This lecture will continue to build upon the last, looking at art in Florence between 1430 and 1500. This will lead us all the way up until the generation that will be identified as the High Renaissance, beginning with Leonardo da Vinci. We will begin with an artist named Fra Angelico, or Angelic Brother, who was a monk and lived in the monastery of San Marco in the far north of the city. Now in 1438, the Dominicans from Fiesole transferred here to San Marco, and Cosimo is going to patronize Michelozzo, the architect, to build a new church and a monastery with his own very cell, showing how penitent he was for the money the Medici had made, and in so doing, ensuring that the Florentines knew he was a pious ruler. The high altarpiece for the church here attached to it would be the Madonna and Saints of San Marco. This is a reconstruction as the frame has been dismantled. Here we have for the high altar a Madonna and Child surrounded by saints, a type known as a Sacra Conversazione. Here we find below the two patron saints of the Medici, Saints Cosmas and Damian, who were physicians. And we must remember that the Medici comes from the Italian word medico for doctor, where we get our term medical from. So these are physician saints. Now there's a golden curtain behind the Madonna and Child that is on the backdrop, and another one that parts on either side of the image along with garlands. The Madonna is enthroned in a Brunelleschian type of architecture, like that seen in Masaccio's Holy Trinity, showing the awareness of these earlier trends in painting. Here we can see how closely aligned this set of Roman architectural principles is. It's almost a carbon copy of what we saw earlier in Santa Maria Novella. Now the type that we see here is unique to Italy. The Sacra Conversazione, or Sacred Conversation, is going to have the Madonna and Child surrounded by a series of saints that lived and died in different eras. Therefore, it is miraculous that they are all brought together. Obviously, the idea is the more saints you have, the more power they can bring to bear upon your prayers and to work on your behalf. Since this is a Dominican monastery, we see Dominican saints off to the right in their black and white habits. There is a new unified sense here of the groupings and figures in illusionistic space. Again, the orthogonal lines trace their vanishing point to the Virgin Mary's head, showing us who the focal point is here as the Mother of God. She is also going to be set within this larger context. Now, Fra Angelico, along with his assistants, would fresco the corridors in 44 individual cells on the second story here in the monastery, while Saint Antonine oversaw it, a famous Florentine saint ruling this monastery at the time as the abbot. Now, walking up the staircase, as the monks would every day, you are going to then move on to the dormitory cells, up to the left here. Now, every monk must pass this several times a day, therefore we must take into account that he considered the natural light, as you see here coming off from the left. Now here you can see the entire rows of the cells the monks would go into every evening. Now, we find that we're also repeating Michelozzo's architecture from the cloister below, bringing the illusion together into the monk cells, as the Archangel Gabriel comes to deliver the message that the Virgin Mary will become pregnant with the Son of God. Notice again that she is cloistered. There is a gate off to the back, and much greenery and the fruits of paradise behind her. So she is gated, she is closed, just like, once again, a virgin would be. Inside of the various cells where the monks would occupy and sleep and read, and that's about it, we have small, minimalistic paintings that would help them concentrate on their meditation and prayers. St. Peter Martyr, who is a Dominican saint, can be seen here praying and witnessing this vision. Now there is no garden. The experience is entirely mystical. So we were, as a Dominican, following the example of St. Peter Martyr, supposed to witness the miraculous Annunciation, and if we concentrated and meditated hard enough, we would be able also to witness this miraculous event. Here we have the cells of the abbot, the ruler of a given monastery, who was in charge of it. The most famous monk who's going to hold up residence here would be Savonarola, the mad monk as he became known, who would take over the Florentine government, but showing you roughly the size of the administrator's office. This is also the area where we have the first library we discussed with the Medici, and Michelozzo would design it. There would be a series of benches with chains keeping the books in place. You could not check the books out, but of course it's the first time that the general public had access to them. Importantly, Michelozzo was also going to design this interior space to be fireproof and ensure that there was no wood. Turning to the Cathedral of Florence, we see the impact finally of Albertian ideals of integrating figures within space, and this interchange between them. After the mid-century, we see that many of these imitators of the styles we've been discussing fuse them all together. Here, off to the left side of the main nave in the Florentine Cathedral, or Duomo, we have two equestrian monuments that are painted as though they are fictive sculptures on the wall. They celebrate condottieri, or mercenary generals, because in Italy at the time, there were no standing armies from the cities themselves. Instead, cities would hire professional mercenaries with their own armies to fight their battles for them. Obviously, if you had more money, you could hire a better general, and there'd be a greater likelihood that you would succeed in battle.
The first artist we'll look at is Paolo di Danno, also known as Uccello, nicknamed Paul the Bird. He was apprenticed to the goldsmith Ghiberti, so we know that he would have been interested in three-dimensional form, given the commissions Ghiberti was receiving from the Florentine baptistry and those from Or San Michele. Now we know that Paolo had a long career, but he painted quite little, and his patrons often complained of his unconventionality. That being, he's going to work incredibly slowly and is very strange in many ways when it comes to his approach. He has no major altarpieces to his name or huge fresco cycles. Now, for the Florentine Cathedral, Uccello is going to be commissioned to produce a fresco in place of an original equestrian monument. On the interior to the left, one will notice there are two different fresco paintings on the walls of these fictive, illusionistic equestrian monuments, both the condottieri, or mercenary generals that helped Florence win battles. Here you're going to have the portrait of Sir John Hawkwood from 1436, which will be very influential later for Donatello's Gattamelata that we looked at. This is going to be commissioned by the Opera del Duomo, or the organization in charge of decorating the cathedral. And the commission is to celebrate the English condottiere who died in 1394, at which time Florence had promised him and his family an equestrian marble statue to be over life size and located in the area. Instead, this was substituted for a fresco in 1395, a year after the condottiere's death. This replaced the original version of that fresco painted in the 14th century. Here we have the statue appearing as though it is a bronze equestrian monument. The frame, which is added later, destroys the fictive illusion that originally was more convincing of the statue mounted on the wall. Now, at the base, it appears as though it's being supported by three consoles, like cantoria in cathedrals, much like the famous one seen here in the Opera del Duomo's museum by Luca della Robbia, where you would have individuals singing from them like a choir, hence the name, the singing projection. Now, if we compare the statue to the later version that he inspired, you can see that Uccello's approach is quite different from that of Donatello. In fact, you find that Uccello's is only in contemporary 15th century attire in this instance, holding the baton as he strides forward on the horse with the head pulled back. Now, you find that Donatello's is going to be a bit more formal, as we find that the tail is free with Uccello's. The hoof paws the air, right, instead of very carefully balancing on the cannonball. And the baton is going to be pulled more comfortably towards the chest of Sir John Hawkwood in this instance. All more relaxed than that of Donatello's commanding presence. Now, the way in which the statue would have originally been viewed would have been in de sotto in su, or the worm's eye view, seen from below, as we can see underneath the cantoria here, and the statue, however, is inconsistent for a reason. So he follows the perspectival grid very carefully with these orthogonals, leading down to a vanishing point at the floor line. Now, the statues, or the fictively painted statues, today are hung lower on the wall after they were restored. Thus, the vanishing point is actually below the pavement now, and the illusion doesn't work as effectively as it once had. Now, the inconsistent perspective, whereby we see the cantoria from below, or the support on which is written Paoli Uccelli Opus, or the work of Paolo Uccello, and then above in Latin laying out that this is going to be John, right, the Briton, who's going to be illustrated above. So you find that the support is carefully rendered in linear perspective, but the statue above is seen as though it's looked at straight on, or in profile. So this is going to be the case because originally he had everything properly painted by way of perspectival rendering, and you could only see the underside, the belly, and the genitals of the horse, and the feet of the rider. Given that this did not fulfill the requirements of equestrian monument, whereby you can see someone's physiognomy and identify them and their station, the patrons for the works, the Opera del Duomo, objected and rejected this original version, asking Uccello to scrape off the horse and rider above and repaint it so that he could be seen. Here's an example from Venice of these dal sotto in su views, which can be quite uncouth depending upon the angle at which you're looking at them. So obviously we are not able to see the horse and rider equally in the proper perspectival rendering, so it must have been changed. Now, turning to the cathedral, we find that he's also going to be commissioned to make a pint, another condottiere portrait of a fictive marble-carved equestrian monument, in this case for Niccolo da Tolentino. So Niccolo da Tolentino, another condottiere, was holding in his right hand a baton, dressed in contemporary armor, with the wonderfully decorative hat, picking him out on a battlefield, right, on his horse. The lack of consistent perspective, first and foremost, differentiates Castagno's approach from that of Uccello, who's pinioned by perspective, who is bound to recreate it as carefully as he possibly can. In this instance, like his action figures that we just discussed, Castagno is much more interested in illustrating the motion and dramatic action of the figure as it strides ever forward, the horse turning to be foreshortened out towards us, lifting the left leg, trotting forward, right? Obviously, they are in motion as the static geometry of Uccello is gone, seen by way of the fluttering bits of fabric off of the neck here of this condottiero Tolentino. So we can see that in all of his endeavors, Castagno is going to be important as a predecessor to those Renaissance artists who will be interested in monumental, active, and violent forms that are going to be interested in anatomy and the musculoskeletal system.
Looking down the street, we return now to the Medici Palace, which had its own private chapel, and it was decorated just for them. Benozzo Gozzoli would be the one who would paint in a wraparound series the Procession of the Magi, which would integrate the Medici themselves, the greatest members of the family, into a religious event, becoming, in essence, kings searching for Christ. As we see them here, moving from left to right, searching for the newborn king, we have portraits of individual Medici members on horseback, lavishly attired with actual gold leaf that's going to be glued onto the surface of this fresco. It is set up as though a medieval tapestry, with a very high horizon line, unusual for the time because of the advent of linear perspective. Therefore, it would remind one of these earlier decorations for castles and palaces. Here we have a close-up showing the servants and those leading the horses, with the Medici in their characteristic red caps, all of which painted showing this legacy of the Medici. Turning from religious imagery, we now look at that which is pagan or mythological, and the first large-scale Renaissance works devoted to mythological subjects. We know, looking at the front of the Palazzo Vecchio, that there is a connection between Florence and mythological figures, because Hercules himself can be seen in front about to bash the brains in of the cattle thief Cacus.
And the answer to that is simple, that being Hercules was a Florentine hero. He was going to be on their seal since the Dugento or the 1200s, representing fortitude for Christians. So we find that because he persisted through his 12 labors and suffered, he represents and can be understood in a Christian fashion, even as Christ-like, given that Christ also went through the Passion and then died in order to return to heaven with his Father. So in 1460, there are 3 large paintings that are going to be commissioned by Pallaeuolo for these festivals and tournaments, and they are going to illustrate the labors of Hercules. 2 copies of the panels, or the modelli, the models for them, have survived. So these were originally painted on canvas and moved to the Palazzo di Priori because of how closely associated Hercules was with the Florentine Republic. And now we finally see and have an excuse to show the actual forms from antiquity. This is a pagan subject, meaning a Greco-Roman one, illustrating their gods. In this case, a demigod that's going to make his way to Mount Olympus. Now, this is going to be made possible thanks to the spread in the last quarter of the Quattrocento of Neoplatonism, or of an interest in reconciling the philosophy of Plato with Christianity. And here we have that symbol, that seal on the Florentine Republic, which is going to show Hercules with the lion's skin in his right hand and the club, the symbol for his strength, in his left hand. Here in the statue, you see him getting ready to punish this cattle thief Cacus. Thus, he's a very powerful symbol of the might of Florence. Now, in Hercules' labors, many are familiar with, especially the first few, where he slays the Nemean lion or the 9-headed hydra. And then we will also look at some less known examples, which is a side labor from where he's asked to steal the apples of the Hesperides. So Hercules is a very popular figure throughout history, from antiquity surviving through the Middle Ages, because he represents the consummate hero who suffers, just as we can all relate to him. And thus, in Christian terms, he is the symbol of fortitude, who continues despite the impossible tasks in front of him, because he knows it is right and something he must do. Here, in a small modelli, or a preparatory panel painted to record the composition of Hercules and the Hydra, you can see his style that is interested not in linear perspective or mathematics like that of, say, Piero della Francesca or Uccello, but instead on human anatomy and linear precision, using these to inform us of this battle which is between man and nature. Now, the story of Hercules and the Lernaean Hydra is going to come from Greek antiquity, being passed down to the Romans and through the Middle Ages to Christians. In the story, Hera, the stepmother of Hercules, very infuriated with her husband's philandering, makes it her mission to punish him, to make him suffer throughout his life. In this labor, she raises a 9-headed serpent to kill the hero. One head of the multi multi-headed beast is going to be immortal. But when you cut off the other heads, 2 grew back in their place. And repeatedly Hercules battled this beast, cutting the heads off to no avail. It was his nephew Iolaus who assists him in killing a massive crab in the swamp where they're going to come across the Hydra, thus turning into the sign Cancer in the sky in the zodiac. His nephew realizes that if you cauterize the wounds after Hercules cuts them off, they will not grow back, until finally they discover the immortal one and cut it off. Now this is going to be indebted to the action figures of Uccello del Castagno, whereby we see a form here that is not going to be easily defeating this serpent. Instead it is straining and shows us the difficulty of what is happening in this narrative. And true to the Renaissance representation of Hercules, unlike that of antiquity, he holds a club instead of a sword or a bow and arrow. He was known as a great archer in antiquity. But now we literally have the brute force of Hercules set against this venomous snake, this venomous multi-headed hydra. Now, the strain can be seen both on the face and in the muscles of this rather svelte form of Hercules instead of a very hypertrophic one. We're emphasizing the strain here and not the heroic ease with which this demigod defeated this serpent, this very violent foe. Now we see that the forms of the Hydra and the landscape behind show us that we're looking at the struggle between man and nature. For the tail of the Hydra wrapping around the leg of Hercules as it also digs its claws into his thigh, making him bleed here, is going to relate to the winding river behind. So this literally shows the battle, the struggle of man versus nature. Now turning to what he's more famous for, working for the Medici, Botticelli received commissions for a number of mythological subjects, especially for the court of Lorenzo il Magnifico, the Magnificent, who opens the Platonic Academy, expands the public library, and is going to bring many important Florentines into his household. So with Lorenzo, we have the court philosopher being Marsilio Ficino at the same time. And this Neoplatonic philosopher translates Plato into the vernacular and into Latin as well, and is going to interpret these ancient legends and ancient stories in a much more philosophical and appropriately Christian fashion. So the gods of ancient Greece and Rome survived the Middle Ages by way of stories like Ovid's Moralise or the Moralizing Ovid, a series of stories that inform us of how the ancient stories of Greco-Roman gods were merely veiled allegories as to how to live our lives, not literally the philandering of these male and female gods doing horrific things to one another. Now we find that the appearance of these figures, however, were lost because many of the images of pagan subjects were destroyed by Christians because they feared that they were idolatrous. So now we need to revive them, but instead of literally copying from the past, we use the allegorical meaning that is paralleled with Christian subjects. Now, finally, looking at the next generation of, or incarnation of classical stories, we find that Botticelli does slowly introduce the traditional Greco-Roman presentation for some of these figures. The Primavera seen here and commissioned on the part of the occasion of a wedding, and to be seen with the next work we will look at, can be read right to left, in that at the far right we see the west wind Zephyrus will rape the nymph Chloris, thus transforming her into Flora. You can already see her here spouting flowers from her mouth. So she then transforms, after marrying her, into the goddess of spring, seen directly in front of the couple. The goddess of spring now is going to have a series of flowers that she then cascades or throws in front of her. right? So this is relating to the production of new life in spring and also alluding to the procreative function of marriage. Off to the left, after we move past Venus and her son Cupid, we have the three Graces and Mercury. So Mercury off to the far left is going to be in the same pose as Donatello's David, with the same left arm akimbo and shown in the same adolescent fashion. With the caduceus, the symbol of the rod with the snakes wrapped around it, he's going to be waving away or dispelling clouds from this garden of Venus. So this is going to be relating to the Medici's patronage elsewhere and also to the Medici's support in this wedding. That can be seen as well in the fruit above, the symbol not only of the production of heirs and or of children, but also of the Medici symbol for palle or balls. The blindfolded Cupid above Venus is going to be firing arrows at the three dancing Graces. These Graces, remember, are going to be symbols of love and beauty, especially of unmarried virginal women. Now, they're virgins, we can tell, because they are unmarried. Their hair is down and flows loosely around them. Their availability made clear through the diaphanous or see-through drapery as they interlock hands and gracefully tilt their heads, forming these sensuous S-shaped rhythms to the bodies. And the ideal of the body is going to be even more obvious in the next painting associated with them. In the center, we find that Venus is going to have the headdress of a Florentine married woman, a patrician woman. Now that she is married, she covers up her hair, signaling to all appropriate suitors that she is going to be otherwise taken. So you find that now she is fully clothed. We do not see the forms of her body. Her abdomen suggestively is going to be enlarged as though she is pregnant. And we have here all of the information that would be needed for a new bride, going from her role as a maiden to one that is married, right, and that is going to be producing children. And this is the garden, the marriage garden of Venus, representing the couple's marriage. Now, this is going to be related to and for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco and his marriage to the Medici family, and this was made for his nuptial chamber, right? And so this would guide the new bride, telling her what to do. This would have been seen with another painting signaling the birth of beauty in the human mind, and that's going to be the very famous Birth of Venus. The Birth of Venus, as with the Primavera, can be seen today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. A very popular painting. It is life-size and massive, with several figures telling the story of the birth of the goddess of love and sex. Here you find that Zephyrus, the west wind, is going to be carrying himself aloft with this diaphanous drapery blowing about him, with rose petals, right, falling from the sky as he gushes forth with air, pushing the nude Venus on a shell ashore with the white-capped waves below her, and the nymph Pomona ready to clothe her on the island of Cyprus, again with flowers surrounding her, the symbols of Venus. The story, of course, coming from the downfall of or separation of the earth and the sky, as you find that Kronos, with a sickle forged from the center of the earth given to him from Gaia, his mother, is used to sever the genitals of his father, Uranus, and tossed into the ocean, thus out of which a foamy white discharge is going to come, and that is going to be where Venus is born, as she is going to ride the waves aloft to this island. Now, the figures are going to be not realistically painted and anatomically considered, but represent a very poetic and sensuous interpretation here, as we find this wind is going to be blown, and we understand the fragrance of the flowers and the petals is going to be wafting over to these figures. The figures of the nymphs and of Venus relate to the long-necked, elongated, and attenuated forms that you see from the Primavera previously and coupled with it. The strawberry blonde hair being the ideal for the day, whereby the pale ceramic skin is going to inform us of the ideal maiden who is not going to be working outdoors. Now the pose, or she is going to be attempting to cover up her chest and pelvis, is taken from antiquity and is actually from the Venus Pudica pose, made famous by the Medici Venus and the Aphrodite of Knidos, whereby we're going to erotically tease the spectator by noting that we're covering something up, thus something illicit is going to be able to be seen. All right, so you find that the proportions are also going to be greatly exaggerated. And we have this elongated neck, this sensuous S-shaped pose of the figure as it sways back and forth. Obviously not to be taken literally. And because this is a ceremonial banner that would have been carried in a procession on the occasion of a wedding, it also would not necessarily have been understood as overtly sexual. Instead, Ficino interprets the birth of Venus as the allegory of birth of beauty in the human mind. Thus, this is our ability to consider what beauty actually is. And so it does not need to look like a realistic or anatomically correct woman. It is merely an idea. Now, this also illustrates quite clearly the Horatian adage ut pictura poesis. So we find that in the Renaissance, early on, a phrase from the Roman poet Horace, who wrote the art of poetry, the Ars Poetica, is going to have a single phrase in it, ut pictura poesis, that was taken out of context in the Renaissance, but is the basis for all Renaissance art theory. And literally it translates as painting, so poetry. So we get to this idea in the Renaissance that poetry is spoken painting, whereas painting is mute poetry. In other words, we can read paintings like we can sentences or poems. And that is no more clear that in this example, where the Medici court poet Angelo Poliziano, who already wrote a poem for the earlier Mars and Venus, or for the occasion when it was painted, is going to also write a poem entitled The Birth of Venus that's going to be read exactly as this painting is from left to right, where we find the west wind fragrantly blowing rose petals and the nude form of Venus on a shell arrives in the island of Cyprus, where the nymph Pomona will clothe her and worship this goddess of love and beauty. The celebration of sensuality and pagan subjects was short-lived for Botticelli. For Girolamo Savonarola, a very famous prior of San Marco and Dominican monk, is going to take over the city and is going to lead his oppressive religious views and ensure that such paintings are no longer created. He decried the decadence of Medici and Florence that celebrated these pagan subjects and demanded a return to a much more strict interpretation of religion and its role in our lives. He's responsible for, most famously, the Bonfire of the Vanities, whereby he demands that Florentines bring together all of their most precious materialistic and secular objects, including dresses and jewelry and the paintings we just looked at, and called upon them to denounce worldliness and burn these items. So Botticelli himself was wrapped up in this fever, this religious zealot, and burned his own paintings, so we do not have many of them today. Now you find that after the invasion of Charles VIII, Savonarola takes over the city of Florence in 1494. So for 4 years in this reign of terror, he's going to repeatedly attack the papacy, calling the Pope out for his lack of support of traditional Orthodox Catholic values. And he's also going to ensure and place bans on what women can wear in public, having roaming bands of youths who are attacking anyone who publicly does not support his ban on wearing excessive jewelry and or wearing very expensive dresses. This all leads to a backlash whereby the Pope turns against him and then the people of Florence turn against him, torturing and executing him in 1498. In fact, following the execution of Savonarola, Florence did repent, and they did feel very penitent, and erected many monuments to this hero and martyr as they saw him. And of course, today, if you speak to the Florentines, they understand as having the blood of this holy man on their hands. They even memorialized the exact spot where Savonarola and his Dominican brothers were burned at the stake in the center of the piazza. Now turning to the third and final type of painting appreciated in the last quarter of the Quattrocento, we look at Domenico Ghirlandaio. So Domenico is nicknamed Del Ghirlandaio because he is the son of garland dealers and sellers. So literally his name is garland maker. Now you find that Ghirlandaio is going to be trained as a metal worker, a goldsmith, and represents the official mercantile taste in Florence. Therefore, he has the most major fresco series and altarpieces at the end of the century. You find that his prosaic style has little interest in the drama seen previously with Botticelli and or with the dramatic action sequences of Palaiuolo. Instead, like the painting seen here of an old man and his grandson, we see what the middle class prefers, just as today they're going to appreciate straightforward appeals to naturalistically rendered objects and scenes that are easily comprehensible, right? So these naturalistic effects and realistic details are what they appreciate, not something overly complex or poetic. Therefore, in the refectory fresco cycle we have here at the monastery of Ognissanti in Florence, you have a work that is identical to another one he paints for San Marco next to Fra Angelico's work. This work is heavily indebted to the earlier version by Castagno, but unlike that version, this one is doctrinally correct, taking place in the upper room, where we see tree tops here, falcons and pheasants flying about. We are still going to be considering that Tuscan tradition whereby Judas is on the opposite side of the table, which we can see here was in the original design in the Synopia drawing, clearly laying out where each apostle would be and how they would be reacting individually to the news that Christ would be betrayed. Now, obviously, the U-shaped bench here for the apostles to take the bread and the wine from Christ as the establishment of the Eucharist is going to be indebted from Andrea del Castagno. The naturalistic details and the fresh colors located in this, which are considerably brighter than earlier versions, are preferred by merchants in the mercantile class. This image is straightforward and appealing. We know exactly who all of the people are, including Judas and St. John the Evangelist placing his head on Christ's chest. And we know obviously Christ is going to have the halo and has his right hand up in a blessing of benediction. Each one of the apostles in various stages of disbelief at the announcement that someone will betray him. Of course, you find the head and the hand being the symbol for melancholy is also appropriate. Now, everything in the image is going to be clearly symbolic and understandable to this middle-class mercantile audience. So we find that each one of the objects, aside from the apostles, is going to be significant. Number one, we have palm trees, or the tops of a palm tree, off to the right outside, representing the entry into Jerusalem that will take place right after the Last Supper and will begin the Passion cycle, to where he then will be arrested. Next, you're going to have cypress trees off to the left, which mark cemeteries, going back in the Mediterranean tradition to ancient Greece and Rome. So anytime you see a series of cypress trees along a road, they will lead to a cemetery, and they are planted in the middle of monasteries where they bury their dead as well. This represents death in the tradition. Then we have orange trees in front of them, promising rebirth and new life, much like we looked at with Botticelli's Primavera, the promise of something newly created. Off to the side, we have the dove of the Holy Spirit perched on the window sill, showing us that part of the Trinity is present here. So we have the second person of the Trinity in the center, then the dove. Finally, we have birds flying outside, and almost without exception, in most traditions across the world, birds represent souls, in this case, that have been liberated from their bodies and are flying about, unencumbered by the fleshy shell they once inhabited. And speaking of inhabiting fleshy shells, you have a peacock here in the other window. Peacocks, interestingly enough, are a symbol for immortality, because when they find them in the desert, especially in Egypt, they appear to remain intact, the feathers and the body intact. So they thought that its flesh did not decay. So therefore, if we are going to partake in what Christ is offering, we ourselves will also not decay.
Another important work by Ghirlandaio can be found in the Church of Santa Trinita, or the Holy Trinity, which is going to be in the chapel to the front right of the church. Here we have the Sassetti Chapel in Santa Trinita, decorated in 1485. We find that the donor can be seen here, the Sassetti family, kneeling on either side of the high altar. Now remember, this is a burial chapel, so we have the sarcophagi that are going to be flanking them on either side. So we see them painted next to where their bodies would lie. Here we can see the painting surrounding it with a miracle of St. Francis above, who resurrected a boy after he fell from a window. Everything centers on a nativity scene with the Virgin Mary and the newborn Christ. The scene above, as you can see, is going to be a young boy who is laid out on a funeral pyre, whereby there is a floating or levitating St. Francis above him with a gesture of benediction as he brings him back to life with one of his miracles. We have a painting of what the environment outside of this church would have looked like in 1485, an exact replica, if you will, with the boy falling in the background to the left to his death. But of course, St. Francis will remedy that. You can see portraits of the actual family on the left and the right, with the females to the left kneeling in prayer, one looking out at us, and the males off to the right, dressed in contemporary attire, discussing what is happening in front of them, while one at the far right looks back at us as well as a focalizer. Now with the Quattrocento here and the Adoration of the Shepherds, which is the high altar or the altarpiece in this burial chapel, we have this consistent perspective, a careful attention to naturalism and anatomy, as well as ancient motifs. There is not only a series of ancient pillars in the foreground and an ancient sarcophagus, which is right behind Christ, but also in the mid-ground left you see a triumphal arch, commonly seen as erected by Roman emperors, as the kings are going to be coming to see Christ next. So this is going to end the section leading up to the High Renaissance, so be sure to take the next quiz, and we will begin with Leonardo da Vinci next time.